In today's lesson, we're going to examine the process of speciation. That is, the process in which one species splits to form two or more distinctly different species. So let's begin by defining the word species. What does species mean? I think most of us have a general concept of what it means. A species is a specific type of plant or animal or fungus or bacteria, a specific type of living thing that has features, characteristics that distinguish it from all other forms of life. Well, it turns out that in an evolutionary sense, the concept of species is a little bit difficult to define. It can be quite confusing. Look at our own species, Homo sapiens. When you look at people from all around the globe, people from different geographical regions, we see different skin colors and hair colors and facial characteristics and so forth. As different as humans can seem, of course, they're all the same species. We're all Homo sapiens. On the other side of the coin, you look at these two different types of birds, and most people, I think, would assume, hey, they must be the same species. They look almost identical, or they look very similar at least. But when you examine them closely, the eastern meadowlark and the western meadowlark have completely different mating songs and mating rituals. They do not recognize each other as potential mates, and they never interbreed in nature. Therefore, they are considered to be, even though they look alike, distinct, different species. The most common way to define species in biology is called the biological species concept, and it defines a species as a group of populations whose members have the potential to interbreed in nature and produce viable, fertile offspring. So returning to my example of these meadowlark birds, because they do not interbreed with each other in nature, and because they do not recognize each other as even potential mates, their mating rituals are different. By this definition, they are in fact different species. Even though this is the species definition that we most commonly use in biology, it's not perfect, and it doesn't always work. Think, for example, about fossils. If you were to dig up a fossil of a dinosaur, and maybe it looks a lot like a velociraptor, which is a familiar species that we already know about, but this one's a little different. Like, it looks like it's pretty similar to a velociraptor, but it's got some different skull features. Maybe the shape of the teeth are a little bit different. And you're trying to decide, is this in fact a new species of dinosaur that I've discovered, or is this just some kind of subtle variation on a velociraptor? Well, if you use this definition, you would have to know whether or not those two dinosaurs, the velociraptor and this new one that I just dug up, can they interbreed? Well, I don't know. They haven't been alive for 65 million years, so there's no way to know when they were alive on the earth, could they have interbred? So this definition of species is not perfect. It does not work in all cases, but it gives us kind of a working definition that we can use to understand not only what a species is, but how new species come to be. So again, our topic here is speciation, the process by which one species splits to form two or more distinctly different species. That's called speciation. After speciation occurs, if we now have two separate species of butterfly, they share a common ancestor, so it was once a single species, now it's two distinct species. Something is preventing these two different types of butterflies from interbreeding, right? Because if they were able to interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring, then we would still have to consider them to be the same species, even though they look different. But if they are in fact really two different species, there must be some barriers that are preventing them from being able to interbreed. And so we call these barriers reproductive barriers. These are any factors that impede or block members of two species from being able to interbreed and produce viable fertile offspring. In other words, these are the factors that prevent two different species from merging back into just one species. Okay, so after speciation has occurred, now that we have two separate species, what are those barriers that might prevent them from interbreeding with each other and sort of merging back into one species? So there's a bunch of these, 8 of them, and they come in two separate categories, two main categories of reproductive barriers. Prezygotic barriers are going to be the factors that prevent members of two different species from even mating with each other successfully. And then postzygotic barriers would be when members of two different species mate, but something is blocking the offspring from developing or being able to survive. Okay, so let's talk about prezygotic barriers first. We'll go through this list. You need to know the different types of barriers, and you need to know an example of each. So again, a prezygotic barrier is any factor that prevents two different species from interbreeding, and it blocks fertilization. It blocks the sperm and the egg from being able to come together to produce an offspring. So the first type is called habitat isolation. And the example is two different species of fruit fly. Some fruit flies are in a genus called Drosophila. This is a different type of fruit fly. The genus name is Regoletus. So there's Regoletus pomonella, and then there's Regoletus mendax. I think I'm saying that right. So it's two different species of fruit fly. These two species can sometimes be found in the same area, like in the same field. They might only be a few feet apart, but they never interbreed, and they can't ever interbreed because they occupy different parts of the habitat. So Regoletus pomonella, like all fruit flies, lays its eggs on rotting fruit. Those eggs hatch and become maggots. The maggots eat the flesh of the rotting fruit. Then they become adults, and they never leave the tree. They stay right there on that same tree or right underneath the same tree, and they go right back into that same tree to lay their eggs. So generation after generation, this species always is found on or very near either a hawthorn tree or an apple tree. Those are the only two types of trees that you'll find this species. They live on that tree, they mate on that tree, they lay their eggs on that tree. In the same field, a few feet away, you might have a blueberry bush with a different species of fruit fly, Regoletus mendax, lives, mates, lays its eggs only on blueberry bushes. Now, why are they so specific? Why do they tend to cling to one type of tree? That's a little bit of a mystery, but it partly has to do with just the mating habits of these flies. They don't live very long, 30 days or something like that, and they tend to just sort of live wherever they hatch, and so they don't stray very far from the tree that they originate on. So even though you might find both species in the same field, they're going to be on two separate kinds of trees, and so they never interbreed. They have isolated themselves within the same habitat, so they don't interbreed. The second type of prezygotic barrier would be temporal isolation. It comes from the word tempo. And it specifically refers to the tempo of fertility. Like most animals, especially mammals, kind of have a certain time of year that they're fertile, that they're interested in mating, and then the rest of the year they sort of couldn't care less about it. And so in order to interbreed, two animals would have to both be interested in mating at the same time. They would have to both be fertile at the same time. Well, the western spotted skunk, which you see on the left, they always become fertile and look for mates in the late summer. The eastern spotted skunk only mates in late winter. So they are fertile and looking for mates at two different times of the year. Now, there are places out in the Midwest on the prairies where both species of skunk exist. And so you might have a western skunk and an eastern skunk, and they scurry out into the same clearing and they see each other. And you might think, well, why don't they just interbreed? Well, because only one of them is going to be fertile. The other one's not. These two species are fertile at two different times of the year. So even if they are physically together in the same place, they're not going to be able to interbreed. They have a different tempo of fertility. That's called temporal isolation. This is my favorite one to talk about. This again, we're still talking about prezygotic barriers. So these are things that are preventing a successful mating, right, between two different species. A lot of species, especially bird species, have very, very specific mating songs that they sing to each other to attract mates, or mating rituals, little dances that they do to attract potential mates. And every species has its own unique little mating ritual. So two different species are almost always going to have different mating behaviors. And they're not going to recognize each other as potential mates. So you're looking at a picture of the blue-footed booby bird. I'm not making that up. That's what it's called. The blue-footed booby bird, which is found native to the Galapagos Islands. Remember, those were the islands that Darwin sort of made famous when he made his observations there. Only female blue-footed booby birds are interested in and attracted to the mating dance of the male blue-footed booby bird. No other bird species cares or recognizes these little dance moves. And I'm going to see if I can get this to play. I hope this is going to cooperate. It may not, since I'm recording. It was working earlier. And let's see, maybe if I let go of this tool. Let's see if it's going to work. Maybe. Here it goes. Now, watch this little dance. So the male blue-footed booby will dance and kick his feet up into the air to show off those blue feet and splay his wings out and thrust his head in an upward position to attract, there he goes, to attract the female. And only a female of that same species will be interested in this little dance. And if any other bird species is nearby, they're going to have a different dance, a different ritual. Therefore, you don't have any interbreeding between blue-footed boobies and other species of birds. Okay, so behavioral isolation means that individuals from different species often do not recognize each other as potential mates. Why not? Because they have differences in their courtship rituals. Behavioral isolation. Okay, another prezygotic barrier is mechanical isolation. This is when mating between two different species is attempted, like they see each other, they try to mate with each other, but they are structurally, morphologically, physically unable to get their reproductive openings to line up properly so that the sperm can be delivered to the egg. So the classic example of this is these two different kinds of snails. Now, these are closely related species. They look a lot alike, and they're very closely related. They probably had a very recent common ancestor, but they are not, they are no longer considered to be the same species, because one snail species has a shell that is coiled in a clockwise fashion, and the other species, the shell coils in the counterclockwise fashion. So that causes their little genital openings, which are kind of hard to see in this picture, to not line up properly. So they try to mate. They go through the mating behaviors, but the sperm never makes it to the egg because they can't get things to physically line up properly. It's called mechanical isolation. And then the last of the prezygotic barriers is called gametic isolation. This means that there's something about the gametes, the sperm and the egg, of two different species that won't allow them to really come together, and it won't allow fertilization to take place. So mating between two different species is attempted, the sperm is delivered, but for some reason it's not able to actually penetrate the membrane of the egg and fertilize that egg and make a zygote. So an example of this would be two different species of sea urchins. Sea urchins are those spiny little animals that live on the ocean floor, and they're kind of in the same family as starfish. But anyway, the red sea urchin and the purple sea urchin will attempt to mate, and the male will deposit sperm onto the eggs that were laid by the other sea urchin, but the red sea urchin sperm, when they land on the purple sea urchin eggs, the egg surface, the membrane surface of the egg, will not recognize the sperm of the other urchin, and so the sperm never gets to enter. It never actually fertilizes the egg, and you don't get a zygote. So yes, they mated, but they might as well not have, because there's no zygote, there's no offspring. So therefore, the red and the purple sea urchin continue to be separate species. They're no longer capable of reproducing with each other because the eggs don't match up with the sperm. Now, there are some reproductive barriers that exist between different species that do not prevent mating. Like, the mating occurs. The sperm does fertilize the egg, even though it's two different species. But there's something after the mating that's blocking or impeding that offspring from being able to survive or being able to continue to reproduce and, make future generations. So any factor that prevents a hybrid zygote, two different species mate, the baby, the offspring is a hybrid, anything that prevents that hybrid from developing into a viable, fertile adult is called a postzygotic barrier. So the first one is called reduced hybrid viability. So species A mates with species B. They do produce an offspring, but the offspring is very weak. It does not survive very long. It doesn't usually survive long enough to reproduce. So a good example of that is when two different species of salamanders mate. Sometimes fertilization does occur, and you get eggs that hatch, and their little baby salamanders come out, but they don't develop normally, they're frail, and they usually do not live long enough to reproduce. So even though mating occurred, we still consider those two different salamanders to be separate species because their little offspring just really don't make it. Okay, this one's similar. This is reduced hybrid fertility. Now, we just talked about reduced hybrid viability. whether the offspring survives or not. This is different. This is reduced hybrid fertility. So this is where you have a male and a female of two different species, like donkey and horse, two different species. They mate. Fertilization occurs. A zygote is formed. It develops in the mother's womb. The baby is born. And it's perfectly healthy, strong, lives a long, full life. We call that a mule, by the way. If a male donkey breeds with a female horse, the baby is a mule. But the problem is that mule is sterile. So a mule cannot grow up and mate with other mules to make baby mules. The only way to get a mule is to breed two different species together, donkey and horse. By the way, if it's a female donkey and a male horse, it's not called a mule, it's called a hinny. Little interesting bit of trivia there. But in either case, they're sterile, it's a dead end, so we still consider the donkey and the horse to be separate species. Horse, donkey, the offspring is a mule. It's perfectly viable. It lives a long, healthy life, but it is sterile and does not reproduce. That's called reduced hybrid fertility. And I think this is going to be the last one. Yes, the last postzygotic barrier is called hybrid breakdown. And what this means is that, and the example I'm using here is, I believe this is rice plants. Yeah, I had to check my notes. I see it now. Yes, these are rice plants. So you've got two different species of rice, and you cross-pollinate them, or they accidentally cross-pollinate in nature, and so you get an offspring, a hybrid offspring, and it survives just fine, and it's fertile, so it's able to reproduce, unlike the mule, which was not able to reproduce. But in the next generation after that, like when two of the hybrids cross-pollinate, the third generation hybrid, well, I guess technically it would be the second generation of hybrid, is not very viable and not very fertile. So it's called hybrid breakdown because when you cross the two different species, at first you get a perfectly healthy, fertile offspring. But when that offspring grows up and reproduces and makes the next generation, that second generation hybrid is really puny and doesn't live very long and does not reproduce very well. So essentially, after a couple of generations, it goes kaput. And so you really can't consider them to be the same species if they're not able to reproduce together and continue producing generation after generation of offspring. Hybrid breakdown is when mating between different species occurs. It produces vigorous, fertile offspring, but subsequent generations become less strong or less fertile. Okay, so then the question becomes, okay, well, how do new species actually form? Like, how do you go from one species to two separate species? Well, it turns out there's two major ways this can happen. So just as a hypothetical example, look at my little species of fishies here in this body of water. Maybe it's a lake. And they all appear to be the same species. And if this little fishy swims over here and mates with this little fishy, it can produce fertile, viable offspring. So they can all interbreed with each other. So this is one hunky-dory little species. But over time, it speciates. We have speciation. So in the future, we might have two separate species of fish. How does that happen? Well, there's two ways it can happen. If the two groups of fish are prevented from interbreeding by a physical geographic barrier, like in this case, maybe the water level in the lake decreases, maybe there's a drought or there's a shift in river course or something, so the lake water levels drop, and there's kind of a land bridge or something that's physically separating this big lake into two smaller lakes, now there's no way this fish can swim over here and breed with this fish anymore because there's a physical barrier blocking them. That's called allopatric speciation. Sometimes you'll have a less obvious barrier. Like there's nothing preventing this fish from swimming over to the other side of the lake and mating with this fish. There's no physical barrier preventing them, unlike in the previous example. But there must be some unseen barrier that's preventing these green little fishies from breeding with these orange little fishies. If the barrier is not an obvious physical geographic barrier, it's called sympatric speciation. And that's a little harder to understand, but we're going to talk about both of them. Let's talk about allopatric speciation first. Comes from two Greek words, allos and patra. I think I'm saying that right. Allos for other, patra for homeland. So it's basically where the two different groups of organisms find themselves physically separated. They're in separate homelands, or they become separated somehow by a physical barrier. So this is when interbreeding is blocked by a geographical physical barrier. So we talked about how this one way this could happen would be the water level decreasing in a lake so that there's some land that separates what was one big lake into two smaller lakes, and the organisms in Lake A can no longer physically get to the organisms in Lake B, and so they, over time, that since they're not interbreeding, they gradually become more different, because of mutations, because of natural selection, different conditions in the two lakes. So that's allopatric speciation. Another way that this can sometimes happen is if you have a river. Maybe at first there's just a tiny stream flowing through this forest, but over time erosion from that stream or that river carves out a canyon. And so as that canyon widens over millions of years, you might have what was one forest might be separated into two separate forests on opposite sides of this canyon. And with plants, the pollen maybe could still spread by wind, but suppose these were animals. Suppose these were, I don't know, rabbits or something. A rabbit on this side is not going to be able to mate with rabbits on the other side because they have this physical barrier in between them. So that's allopatric speciation. A classic example of this is two different species of squirrel that are found on the north end and the southern end or side of the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon, as you know, is a vast void in the landscape that was slowly carved out by the Colorado River over many millions of years. So presumably at some time in the past, it was possible for squirrels over here to cross over back before this canyon was so large. In the early days, squirrels over here could cross over and interbreed with squirrels over here, and vice versa. So it's probably one species. But as the canyon got deeper and wider, it became less common, and now it's completely impossible for a squirrel on this side to interbreed with a squirrel on the other side. So they have in fact speciated. The southern rim of the Grand Canyon has a species called the Harris's antelope squirrel, and on the northern side of the Grand Canyon you have the white-tailed antelope squirrel. Closely related, sure, but not the same species. And so if you put these two together in the same enclosure, like in a cage or something, they don't really recognize each other as potential mates. Their little rituals are different. They no longer are really capable of interbreeding successfully. Another example of allopatric speciation would be two different species of portfish, an Atlantic species and a Pacific species, and they're kept physically isolated by this little strip of land, the Isthmus of Panama down here in Central America. Um, Before the Panama Canal was built, there was really no connection between the Atlantic and the Pacific in this region. And even now that there is a canal, the lock system prevents most fish from being able to swim back and forth from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So, probably over millions and millions of years, there probably have been times where ocean levels were higher. And so there maybe were times in the past where interbreeding could take place. They could swim back and forth. But with current ocean levels, because there's land separating this type of fish from this type of fish, they don't interbreed. And they have become separate species. So again, it's a physical geographic barrier separating the two. And when speciation happens that way, it's allopatric. And one more example, the cormorant is a flightless species of bird that's found on the Galapagos Islands again. You can see their puny little wings, obviously not capable of flight. But this bird is almost certainly descended from a flight-capable species in South America. And probably some of these birds flew over to the islands a long time ago, millions of years ago, and the ones that were isolated out on the Galapagos were no longer able to routinely interbreed with the mainland species, so over time they became more different. And the island species really have no particular benefit from being able to fly, because they're not having to escape from predators like they would on the mainland, and so they gradually evolved sort of out of their ability to fly. Now remember, besides allopatric speciation, the other major category is called sympatric speciation. And it again comes from Greek. Sym is derived from the Greek syn, which means together. So it literally translates together homeland or same country. So this is when you have organisms living in the same geographic region. There's no physical barriers preventing this plant from breeding with this plant or this plant or this plant. There's nothing physically separating them. And yet some unseen, maybe subtle, hard to detect barrier exists that prevents some of them from interbreeding with the rest of them. And so you get a new species forming right there in the midst of the previous species, even though there's no obvious physical barrier. So if there's no geographical barrier, we call it sympatric speciation. So that means there's got to be something that's blocking gene flow, something that's preventing interbreeding between this plant and this plant. But it's something other than a physical geographic barrier. So what could it be? Well, there's really only three possibilities. It's either polyploidy, or habitat differentiation, or sexual selection. I'm going to explain each of those. So the most common way that new plant species are derived is sympatric speciation by the process of spontaneous polyploidy. And basically what that means is, suppose, I'm just going to pick out maybe this tree right here. Let's say you got a population of whatever kind of trees these are, maybe fir trees or spruce trees, and they're all the same species. They're all one species. But let's say something happens on this tree right here, a fluke, a faulty meiosis event, something goes wrong in meiosis that causes this one tree to produce sperm cells and egg cells that are diploid instead of haploid. Think about that. Sperm and egg are supposed to be haploid, right? But suppose there's a mistake in meiosis that causes this plant, just one tree, to produce diploid sperm and diploid eggs. Now this does happen sometimes. In an animal, it would not result in anything because diploid sperm and diploid eggs don't work in animals. But in plants, remember, plants can self-fertilize. So even though the chromosome number might be wrong, this plant would have a different chromosome number than all the other plants around it. So it can't interbreed with any other plant. But remember, plants can self-pollinate. A lot of plants can. So it can pollinate itself. But the chromosome number is going to be different from all the chromosomes in the surrounding plants. And so this plant with its unique chromosome number is now a distinct species. It is now unable to interbreed with all the plants around it simply because the chromosome number has changed. So when that happens, it's called polyploidy. There's a couple different ways it can happen. You can have a mistake in cell division that causes the chromosome number to double. So this, let's say the species normally has a diploid number of 6, but a mistake happens in cell division, so you get a tetraploid cell. It has, twice as many chromosomes as it should have. And so when that plant undergoes meiosis, you're going to end up with sperm cells and egg cells that are diploid, which means the offspring are going to be, there's that word again, tetraploid. They're going to have twice as many chromosomes as all the other plants growing around them. And so this plant can no longer interbreed with this plant because they have 2 different numbers of chromosomes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 compared to 6. Twice as many. And so now this plant can only breed with itself. And as it breeds with itself, again and again, it's going to produce tetraploid offspring, which have a distinct different chromosome number than all the diploid plants around it. So gene flow is blocked by that difference in chromosome number. There's one other way this could happen. Let's say you have 2 different species of plant and they cross-pollinate. So species A produces gametes with 3 chromosomes, and species B produces gametes with 2 chromosomes. When this sperm and egg get together, you get 5 chromosomes in the offspring. All right, and so eventually, when a mitotic or a meiotic error occurs, you end up with a plant that has twice as many chromosomes, or not twice as many, more chromosomes than either of the original species. I'm getting confused by my own diagram here. So the point is, this plant can no longer interbreed with either species A or species B because it has a unique and different chromosome number from those other 2 species. So polyploidy means that the chromosome number spontaneously has changed because of some mistake, some error that occurs in cell division, and it results in an offspring that has a different chromosome number than its parents. Therefore, it can no longer interbreed with its own species. And therefore, it is now a distinct, new, different species. Another way that sympatric speciation can occur is through habitat differentiation. So I'm going to go back to one of the species of fruit flies that we discussed earlier, Regoletus palmanella. This is the fruit fly that only lays its eggs and only is found on either apple trees or hawthorn trees. If you're not familiar with hawthorn trees, this is a hawthorn tree. Here it produces a little red fruit that's smaller than an apple but kind of looks like an apple. Well, even though you have this one species on both kinds of trees, hawthorn trees and apple trees, because they tend to stay on the tree that they hatch on. In other words, a fruit fly that hatches on an apple tree is going to lay its eggs on that same apple tree and produce its offspring, and they're going to lay their eggs on that same apple tree, and they're never really going to stray from that tree. Likewise, if a fruit fly emerges from its egg on a hawthorn tree, it's going to live the rest of its life on that hawthorn tree. It's going to reproduce on that hawthorn tree, and it's never going to interact with those other fruit flies that are over here on the apple trees. Even though they might be only a few feet apart, they tend to stay on their own little particular type of tree. And so we consider this to still be one species, but it very likely is on its way to becoming two separate species. Because if they continue to differentiate in this way, they're not really interbreeding. And so over time, they are going to become more and more different. The hawthorn flies and the apple flies will become more and more different over hundreds of generations, and eventually they will be two separate species, and that would be a classic example of sympatric speciation by habitat differentiation. And finally, the last way that sympatric speciation can occur is through a process called sexual selection. All right, so to illustrate how sympatric speciation can occur through sexual selection, let's use the example of Lake Victoria, a lake in East Africa. In this lake, there are 500 different species of fish. These fish are called cichlids, and like I said, there's 500 plus different species of these cichlids, and they're all very closely related. They probably all are descended from a very small number of species that originally inhabited this lake. And they come in different color varieties. If you look at their body color and you look at their dorsal fins, you'll see different color patterns. And what's happened is the reason there's so many species of this particular kind of fish is because the females of this species are extremely picky about whom they are attracted to as far as males for breeding purposes. So in this species, which I will not even begin to try to pronounce, this species of cichlid, the males have what's called a red tinged back. And the females, as you would expect of this species, show a very strong preference for red. The brighter that red coloring, the more attracted the female is going to be, and the more willing she's going to be to lay her eggs and allow that male to fertilize them. This other species, notice a different species name here. This species, shows the females show a strong preference for blue. And so over many, many generations, because the females are selecting only the bluest of the blue males to mate with, and over here, this other species, the females are only mating with the brightest red males, it's caused these two to look more and more different over time. It's drastically limited their ability to interbreed because no female of this species is going to have any interest in mating with a male who's bright red. And likewise, no female of this species is going to be interested at all in mating with a male who's blue. And so that's called sexual selection, and it has caused distinct species to develop simply because of this strong mating preference that exists amongst these fish. Okay, so two different models have emerged in the scientific community as the process of speciation is discussed and debated amongst biologists. The traditional view, which is called the gradual model or the gradualism concept, says that when a species undergoes speciation and two separate species emerge, that over a very long period of time, they gradually become more and more and more different. Kind of makes sense, and probably, Probably most of the time this is what's happening. But a more recent model that has emerged, that was first proposed in the 1970s, is called the punctuated model. Sometimes it's referred to as punctuated equilibrium, which says that most of the change that occurs between two different species occurs in a relatively rapid burst right at the time of speciation, like right at that moment where they split and they became two separate species, that's where most of the differences came from. And that after they speciate, both species then experience a long period where they really don't change much. They change a lot when they first speciate, and then they stay the same over time. Now, which one of these is correct? Well, they're probably both correct. They probably both happen, and it's probably not an either or. It's the real truth probably most of the time is somewhere in between these two proposed models. But it's important, I think, to kind of know the basic characteristics. So let's just quickly go through them. So the concept of punctuated equilibrium was first proposed by a famous evolutionary biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, and his colleague Niles Eldredge. This was in 1972 that they first used the term punctuated equilibrium. It says that a new species changes the most during a relatively rapid burst of change that occurs right at the speciation event. So if we're talking about a species that has existed for, let's say, 5 million years, just to pick a number, if we're talking about two different species that have existed for 5 million years, most of the differences that evolved in those two species accumulated in the first 30, 40, maybe 50,000 years. Now, 50,000 years is just a blink of an eye in the evolutionary time scale. That's a rapid burst of change. And then after that, for almost 5 million years, each one of these species, now that they're separate species, they have been in a period of equilibrium where they haven't changed very much. Okay? So it's called punctuated model or punctuated equilibrium. The more traditional view is that when you have one species splitting into two, that at first the differences between the two might be almost negligible. Like there's clearly something preventing their interbreeding, but they're still very, very, very similar. And that over the 5 million years or so, very subtle, very gradual differences start to accumulate in the two species since they are no longer interbreeding. And so they gradually become different. They start out almost the same, and then they get a little bit different and a little bit different, and the whole process takes a long, long time for those differences to really accumulate. Again, which is correct? Is gradualism the correct idea, or is it punctuated equilibrium? It's probably a little bit of both. Some situations, some speciation events probably follow the punctuated model. A lot of them probably follow the gradualism model, and maybe it's sometimes somewhere in between. There's still things we're trying to figure out about evolution. This is one of them. Okay, I want to close with something that's kind of interesting to think about. Creationists and proponents of an idea called intelligent design often criticize the theory of evolution by saying something like this. They'll say natural selection, this random process of evolution, could not possibly have resulted in a structure so exquisitely complex as the human eye, that complex system that allows us to have visual acuity. There's no way that could have evolved from a random process. And that's often used as a criticism to try to rip apart evolutionary theory. Well, that argument is based on at least two false premises. First of all, the idea that evolution is a random process. That's not true. Now, evolution is somewhat dependent upon random chance mutations. That part's true. But the process of natural selection is certainly not a random process. it's not random who's surviving and who's reproducing and who's not. It's not random which genes are getting passed down to the next generation and which are not. Natural selection is a very sophisticated sorting process that allows only certain genes to get passed down, only the genes that improve the fitness of the species. So evolution as a whole and natural selection is not a random process. The other false premise is the idea that each of the separate parts of the eye are completely interdependent. So people say, well, there's no way the human eye could have evolved from less sophisticated eyes. There's no way, because if you take away the lens, or if you take away the retina, or if you take away any part of the eye, the whole eye stops working. Or so the argument goes. That's not true either. We know that functional eyes of various levels of complexity do exist in nature. It is conceivable that gradual modifications by natural selection could have led to increasingly complex eye structures over time. And it's kind of interesting. This seems to have happened twice in the animal kingdom. The camera type eye that we have, with a pupil and a lens, a pupil for allowing light to pass through, a lens for focusing that light, and then a retina for stimulating light-sensitive cells to actually make an image in our brain. Those three components have evolved twice. Once in invertebrates, like squid and octopus, and a second time in vertebrates, fish, amphibians, reptiles, and of course us mammals. So the question is, how did this happen? Well, let's use mollusks as an example. There's a whole range of eye complexity in the group of animals that we call mollusks. So limpets, which are these really simple shelled mollusks, single-shelled mollusks, they don't really have what you would recognize as an eye. They do have a patch of tissue with photoreceptors, light-sensitive cells. They have no way to focus the image. They have no pupil, no lens, they kind of have just the beginnings of a retina, and that's it. The slit shell mollusk, this guy here, has an eye that's a little more sophisticated. It's called an eye cup. So basically they have a retina. They have kind of a depressed C-shaped structure that's lined with photosensitive cells, light-sensitive cells. They can detect light, but they have no pupil to control the entry of light, and they have no lens to focus the image. The chambered nautilus is another type of mollusk. It has a retina, and it has the beginnings of a pupil. It has a way of controlling how much light. You can see its pupil right there. So it can control how much light gets in, and it has a way to receive the light with photosensitive cells on its retina. The murex, which is a marine snail, has an even more sophisticated eye because it not only has a pupil, but it has a primitive lens to focus the light, which then stimulates cells on the retina. And in a squid, you have an eye that's almost as complex as the human eye. It's analogous to the human eye. In other words, squid evolved this eye structure separate from us, separate from vertebrates, as a result of convergent evolution, but it's very similar to the human eye. They have all three components. They have a fully developed pupil that's protected by a cornea. They have a lens which can change shape to focus the light beam, and they have a sophisticated retina for picking up the light signals and stimulating light-sensitive cells, which sends a message to the central nervous system to be processed, exactly like the way our eye works. And in some ways, the retina of the squid is is more advanced than the human retina. They don't have a blind spot on their retina the way vertebrates do. So that's kind of an interesting little side note. But the point is, you can't say that there's irreducible complexity in this eye. You can't say that if you took away the lens, none of the other parts would have any function. Because we know there are animals that have retinas and no lens. We know there are animals that have no lens or pupil, and yet they still have the ability to have some sense of light perception or vision. So this is a false premise. The theory of evolution does explain, and the idea of natural selection does explain how the exquisitely complex human eye could have evolved through a natural process. Okay, your extra credit opportunity for this week is to email me with the word speciation in the subject line, and in the body of your email, explain how the punctuated equilibrium model is different than the gradualism model of speciation. How is the punctuated equilibrium model different from the gradualism model of speciation? And the word speciation should be in your subject line. Good luck. Sorry about the long lesson. Have a great day, guys.